actually improve the health of the body, the metabolic health of the body. And that's sort of what I describe in the book Genius Foods.
Well, you have touched on some things that are so not only fascinating, but right on target as far as I'm concerned. Now, have you gone also into a little more detail in regards, or I don't know if the book does, but how this is affecting our mitochondria? So, we're talking about how it's affecting our cells, but is it going deeper to the point in which it's affecting our mitochondria, which is then keeping them from communicating with other cells that can even help them protect themselves from these either viruses or diseases?
Yeah. Alan, that's a great question. And, there's a lot of talk these days about mitochondria. Mitochondria are certainly important. They're the power plants to our cells. So all of the energy that your brain cells need to help you to seize the day and to do all of the things that you love rely on mitochondria. But just to take a step backwards, mitochondria are organelles. So they're located within the cell. Mm-hmm. But over the course of writing Genius Foods, one of the discoveries that I made that really, I think, guided how I approached the subject and my recommendations in the book. You see, for nutrients and fuels to get to mitochondria, they first have to be able to enter the cell. And the boundary of every cell is called the cell membrane. And the cell membrane basically serves as the skin of the cell that separates the interior contents of the cell from what is outside of the cell. And it aids in the transport of nutrients and fuels into the cell, and it also keeps toxins out of the cell. So I began looking at how to keep the cell membrane healthy and functioning at its most optimal, because that really, to talk about mitochondria without talking about the cell membrane puts the cart before the horse.
Okay.
So I started looking at fats and the kinds of fats that we're eating in our diets, and what kinds of fats we really need to consume that promote supple, fluid cell membranes. So a healthily functioning neuronal cell membrane has to possess the property of fluidity. So if you think about, this border that basically protects the interior contents of the cell, but selectively lets nutrients and fuels to enter it, there are various receptors that lie underneath the cell surface that are essentially the ears of the cell that need to bob up to the surface in order to hear the messages that the cell is basically sent. Some of these messages are sent by neurotransmitters. So when we think about healthy brain function, we think about neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, which is involved in feeling reward. Serotonin is involved in mood, but it's also heavily involved in executive function. And then there's a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, which is involved in memory and learning and attention. And this is one of the neurotransmitters that's actually involved in Alzheimer's disease. And so I realized that, the standard American diet has become awash in a certain type of fat called omega-6 fats. Mm-hmm. Omega-6 fats are really important to brain health. In fact, in the hunter-gatherer diet, it's believed that we consume these omega-6 fats in a ratio with omega-3 fats in a proportion of about 1-to-1. Mm. But today we overconsume omega-6 fats, which creates essentially rigidity of the cell membrane, which impairs the receptors of these neurons, the ability to bob up to the surface and receive outside messages. So to me, the most important thing to do is to really look at the fats that you're consuming and make sure that you're not consuming an overabundance of omega-6 fats, and instead make sure that you're getting an adequate amount of healthy omega-3 fats from fatty fish, salmon, mackerel, herring, sardines, things like that, and to avoid polyunsaturated grain and seed oils that are rich in omega-6 fats, like canola oil, soybean oil, and corn oil, for example. And by doing so, you're actually also going to be helping your cell mitochondria directly and indirectly, but essentially in the context of these neuronal cell membranes, you're going to help fuel more effectively get to that mitochondria, which are, again, the power plants of your cells.
Yeah, I know, and you're mentioning fuel, and first of all, yes, I completely agree that they need to be able to communicate with the rest of the body, and from the standpoint of fuel, I know that we need fats, and that I think that we've gotten to this point where people believe that they have to remove fat out of everything. They have to remove carbs. They have to remove all of these things, and yet the fat is actually what's giving us the energy. And without the energy, they're not communicating, and without communicating, is that now causing part of this breakdown?
Yeah, I mean, there's a global energy crisis, and it has nothing to do with gasoline and everything to do with our brain health. So the brain is the most energy-hungry organ in the body. In fact, 25% of everything that you eat and all of the air that 25% of every breath you take goes to create energy in your brain cells, in these mitochondria. And the brain has two fuels that it can use. Two predominant fuels. One is glucose, which in the standard American diet is the predominant fuel that the brain will use, because your average American today consumes about 300 grams of carbohydrates per day. So that is a constant glut of glucose that the brain will use to generate energy. The problem is the brain is like the universe's most advanced hybrid car, and glucose can be sort of analogous to gasoline in a hybrid car, for example. But the electricity, the clean-burning fuel, is actually fat. The brain loves to use fat for fuel. In fact, I consider fat our brain's birthright fuel. You see, when a human baby is born, a baby comes packaged with an abundance of fat to fuel its developing brain. This is because a human baby continues its cognitive development out in the real world. This is what some refer to as the fourth trimester. But today, our ability to use fat for fuel is shunted by the fact that our diets have become saturated with carbohydrates. But by consuming a diet that is higher in fat and lower in carbohydrates, this allows your brain to use fat for fuel in the form of ketones. So the brain can't directly use fat for fuel, but your liver has no problem converting fats to ketones, particularly in the context of a low carbohydrate diet. And so by allowing your brain to use fat for fuel instead of glucose, you're essentially creating more energy with less collateral damage, because like gasoline, one of the byproducts of glucose metabolism is waste. But a lot less waste is generated when fat is being used for fuel by the brain than when glucose is being used for fuel by the brain. And how this all adds up to reduced risk for developing diseases like Alzheimer's disease, it's not yet fully certain, but there are some very interesting trials that have been published recently using diets that allow the brain to use fat for fuel in the context of Alzheimer's disease, patients that have already been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and also a form of cognitive impairment called mild cognitive impairment, which is often considered pre-dementia. And it's been shown in these small trials that a ketogenic dietary intervention, meaning a diet that allows the brain to run on fat instead of carbs, actually has been shown to improve cognitive function in patients with mild Alzheimer's disease. So to me, this is very hopeful news, and it certainly warrants further research before we can make any definitive conclusions. But from an evolutionary sense and from a brain energetic sense, it makes perfect sense to me. And these are all the things that I'm hopeful for future research. But I think that the current state of research is very empowering nonetheless, and I go to great lengths to detail it accurately and responsibly in Genius Foods.
Well, I think the $64 question here then is, at a time in which our country is in a huge healthcare crisis, why is it that our government continues to allow essentially the manufacturers of these products to continue to put that out there, and is not helping to get this information that you're providing right now out to all of its citizens?
I mean, that's such an important question. If you were to look at the total planted land mass of the United States, 65% of the planted land mass in the U.S. is given to wheat, corn, and soy. 5% is dedicated to growing vegetables. So when somebody comes out and says that, these exact kinds of foods that we've dedicated so much of our land mass to growing, and of course, not to forget about all of the financial subsidies given to growers of these exact kinds of products, it makes sense that the economic system as it's currently set up and the food system wouldn't be too fond of my message, as it pertains to reducing our dependence on grains like wheat, corn, and soy, and consuming more vegetables, which is ironic because 90% of Americans today are deficient in at least one essential vitamin or mineral. And this is exactly why when you go to the supermarket and you look at all of the packaged foods that line the supermarket shelves, you'll notice that they're all enriched with various vitamins and nutrients, but these are essentially synthetic vitamins that are added to these ultra-processed foods. It's the dietary equivalent of putting lipstick on a pig. But when you look at vegetables, which are, they're, first of all, they don't contribute to the massive rates of type 2 diabetes and obesity that we're seeing in this country. We know that not enough Americans are consuming vegetables. And the incredible amount of micronutrients that they contain, to me, it's a no-brainer, no pun intended, that these should really be making up the bulk of our diets. So, yeah, I think this is something that it's a systemic problem, and my role, I feel, is really to help give people the information and give it to them in an accessible and approachable way, so that at least it's informed consent when they choose to buy some of these products that we're talking about, for example. I always say that, my role is not, especially, coming from a background in journalism, I don't have a medical degree. It's not to provide advice. It's to provide information that is accessible and exciting and that instills hope. Because, I know that not all people, certainly many people today, are interested in ways to prevent things like Alzheimer's disease and dementia, with rates expected to triple in the coming years. I mean, there are currently 10 million people walking in the United States, at least, that are at risk.
Max,
I think not everybody's necessarily tuned into dementia-related content. So my goal is really to make it exciting and accessible for all people, and to really package this in terms of brain performance, which is related to neuroprotective diets as well.
Max, this is Bob Fisher calling, and Max, I do have an MD, but yet the information that you provide is very necessary. And there are some issues within the healthcare delivery system, particularly in our system, about fragmentation. Meaning the urologist speaking with the cardiologist, the diet may be good for the heart, not good, as good, or as efficient. I think your term efficiency is very interesting for the brain. But the bottom line is you also make some references to evolution. And certainly in psychiatry and throughout the world now, the issue is one of brain function and consciousness. And that's a very big, for me, area of exploration. And there for 1,000 years, there have been different systems, particularly yoga, that really focuses on diet. And I guess a basic fundamental question is regarding a vegetarian diet. And then you move from vegetarian to vegan, et cetera, the issue of proteins. I mean, how necessary is protein? And when you talk about, I think you're exactly right on the money when you talk about cell membranes. And basically a conceptual model is cell membranes are semi-permeable, meaning it lets some stuff through, doesn't let other stuff through, and that's the essence, I think, of what you're talking about in terms of flexibility. So please comment on the yoga system of diet and the evolutionary, and as we evolve, as consciousness evolves, from your vantage point, please talk about vegetarian and diets and what helps, what really helps.
Well, yeah, so it's a very important question. I get asked a lot about the place of animal products in a brain optimal diet. Researchers speculate that it's not just